Do you believe in ghosts, in what's often called the paranormal, the unexplained, the presence of something unseen close by and definitely malevolent? A Harris poll taken in the United States a few years ago found that over 40% of Americans believe in ghosts, and the percentage here is more, 50%, which surprised me. But it shouldn't have. After all, Harry Potter was well aware of a poltergeist called Peeves at Hogwarts School. He was uncontrollable and a constant pain. And poltergeists, noisy spirits, seem to have had an enduring fascination for people. 284 Green Street, Enfield in North London, is the site of Britain's best documented poltergeist haunting. During 18 months, starting in the summer of 1977, Peggy Hodgson and her 4 children witnessed moving furniture, flying objects, and levitation. Around 30 people claimed that they saw some sort of unexplained activity at the house, including Hazel Short, the local lollipop lady, who saw one of the daughters, Janet, levitating at the bedroom window. But many said the family were making it all up, using basic conjuring tricks in order to get a better council house. The story inspired a number of documentaries and films, including The Enfield Hauntings, starring Timothy Spall and Juliet Stevenson. And the incidents that created the story remain intriguing. In 1973, The Exorcist became the highest-grossing horror film of all time, with its story of a little girl possessed by a demon.
The power of Christ compels you!
Dennis Wheatley was second only to Agatha Christie in the bestseller lists with his tales of devil worship and the occult.
Black magic is invoking occult forces to give you some sort of personal help.
Who's Tom?
And in public halls around the country, self-styled mediums like Doris Collins claim to be able to contact the dead at mass seances.
Who did you know that played the mouth organ?
It was my first husband.
I got them both here then?
Yeah, you must have that. Yeah.
Even an edition of Radio 4's topical phone-in Tuesday Call, which I hosted in the 1970s, was devoted to the paranormal. We're inviting your calls on ghosts, which, according to some traditions, are seen in large numbers at this time of the year.
On one occasion...
In 1976, reports surfaced of a family in Long Island, New York, who had experienced strange goings-on in their new house. Kathy Lutz witnessed her daughter Missy apparently enthralled to an invisible presence.
And when I opened the door, she had a small white rocking chair in the corner. Missy was talking and the rocking chair was rocking, and you could hear another voice.
But in Britain, it was the Hodgson family in Enfield whose story caught the imagination. On the night of the 31st of August 1977, Peggy Hodgson entered her children's bedroom to find the dressing table moving across the room.
I just couldn't believe it. In fact, I pushed it back twice, and the third time I couldn't move it.
The uncanny event was accompanied by repeated knocking noises. She sent for her neighbour, Vic Nottingham.
We couldn't make out what it was. I heard the knocking as I walked in the front door, but I went all over the house. Just couldn't make out what it was, so in the end I thought to myself, well, there's only one thing, I'll call the police.
WPC Carolyn Heaps was first on the scene, and she described seeing a chair sliding across the room.
It came off the floor, or nearly a half inch, I should say, and I saw it slide off to the right, about 3.5 to 4 feet before it came to rest.
With the police at a loss for what to do, the neighbours called the Daily Mirror. Photographer Graham Morris was confronted with the chaotic scene of marbles and Lego bricks flying through the air.
One of them hit me on the head. I mean, I felt it. If someone had thrown it, they would have had to have really put a lot into it. It's not just a flick.
And then all of a sudden a pool of water come from nowhere.
With a growing group of eyewitnesses, the bizarre events continued.
And as we walked out there, the toilet brush just come up and settled on top of the toilet.
I've got one chap at work, for instance, and he says to me, how's your ghost getting on?
4 days into this peculiar activity, Vic Nottingham was clearly troubled by what he'd seen.
Well, I was straight. I mean, I'm 44 and I've never witnessed anything like it before in my life, but being a roofer by trade, it's beginning to get on top of you. Your nerves begin to shatter a little bit.
Well, with me to relive the extraordinary events of the Enfield Poltergeist case are three people who witnessed the goings-on at first hand. Graham Morris, who took the famous photographs for the Daily Mirror of the girls, Janet and Margaret Hodgson, levitating. Ros Morris, no relation, who covered the story for BBC Radio, first on The World This Weekend and then in documentary form. And Richard Gross, a newly qualified solicitor at the time, who was brought in to help his father, a leading psychic researcher, Maurice Gross, with his own observations, and is still, to the best of his knowledge, the only member of the Law Society to have cross-examined a ghost. Well, we'll come to that, Richard Gross, but what were your feelings about poltergeists and strange goings-on before the Enfield incidents?
I had no feelings, I had no understanding, I had no experience. And I think it's also fair to say that my father, who was the lead investigator throughout, was a businessman, joined the Society for Psychical Research and read, but he always felt that in order to further knowledge, he would have to go out into the field and confront whatever was going on out there. At the time, I was living at home, and often I would come back from a night out at 2:30 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and I would greet my father walking out of the house, jumping in his car and going off to Enfield.
And Graham Morris, you were a photographer on the Daily Mirror, and somebody said, look, why not go and have a look and see what you can see and try and get pictures of it?
Yes, I was sort of on duty that night. It was quite amusing, actually, because a phone call came through from Peggy Nottingham, the woman next door, when they'd taken the family, the girls and the mother, into their house because of all the goings-on in their own house. And she'd phoned up the chap on the news desk, and she told him what was happening. And he said to her, yes, OK, well, give us a ring back when the pubs are shut, because he didn't believe a word she was saying. And she took him literally. She thought that he was just about to pop out to the pub. So she phoned back about an hour later and said, oh, I was told to phone back when the pubs were shut. I think they're shut now. So anyway, as I was saying, and then carried on with the story, just about to have the phone put down on her almost again, when she said, oh, the police officers have seen it. And then obviously ears pricked up in the office, and they thought, well, there must be something in it.
Did you think, oh, this is just another job?
I did to start with, yes, yeah. I certainly didn't after I walked into the house.
Because?
Well, I mean, it was certainly life-changing then. It was. We went to the house next door. We went to the Nottinghams. The children were all asleep, but they suggested, really, that I would go through into the house first of all, because if anything was going to happen, it was happening when the children were there. And I stood in the gloom in the kitchen, and one by one they brought the children in, asleep in adults' arms, sort of thing. The last one to come in was Janet. Suddenly, things just took off and just started flying around the room.
And you actually got hit by a flying object?
Yeah, I got hit by a Lego brick over my right eye. Gave me a bit of a lump for a few days. So it's a fair bit of force. It was just...
And there were marbles as well?
Marbles, there were just all sorts of things that were left around in the kitchen, taking off and flying around the room.
Did you think at the time somebody must be chucking this at me?
Yes, now that's why I wanted to get back into the corner and just watch everyone. I was watching the children, I was watching... Well, all of them, really. None of them were doing anything.
I mean, what was your first thought when you were hit by a flying Lego brick?
Is my flash working properly?
We'll come back to your story, Graham, but Ros Morris comes into this story now because you actually also got, in a sense, dispatched.
I was a reporter, BBC radio reporter at the time. It was a very slow news day, and we didn't have enough to fill the World This Weekend programme on the Sunday. So I was told that if nothing else happened, I would have to follow up the Daily Mirror and go to Enfield to look at this ghost story. I was very sceptical and looking out for any ways that there could be trickery involved, but I interviewed Mrs. Hodgson, and she seemed to me to be a very normal, sincere person, also very frightened by the whole things that had been going on. After the girls went to bed, there was a very loud crash upstairs in their bedroom, and I went upstairs with Maurice Gross, and it appeared that something had moved a chair across the bedroom. There had been a very big thump, and it went right across the room about 9 feet. And I did think this would have been impossible for the girls to do, as they were actually in bed.
What was your impression of the family, the Hodgson family, when you visited?
Well, my first impression was they were very poor. They didn't have much money. She was a single mother with 4 children. People have said, oh, well, they did this to get a better council house, but actually she never wanted a better council. She had a good house as far as she was concerned. And in fact, she stayed in the house, and that's where she died in 2003.
And indeed, they never made any money out of it either.
No.
If there was an accusation that there was some kind of pecuniary advantage, it never existed.
We look at journalism now, we talk about checkbook journalism, all the rest of it. That was never the case in this story. Poor working-class families would take a newspaper. They were loyal to a newspaper. If they had a problem, they wrote to them and they said, look, we've got this problem. Can you help us? What can we do? And that was just what they did. They had no idea what was going on, and they just thought, we'll phone our paper, the Daily Mirror. We'll phone them up and say, right, what happened?
Wasn't it the Mirror who contacted the Society for Psychical Research?
Yes, it was.
And that's how Maurice Grosse ended up there.
And Richard, you eventually accompanied your father, didn't you, to the house?
Every breakfast time, my father would play a tape or two. It started off with noises, bangings, and he was getting very excited about this, and I must say that I was completely unmoved. And then it moved on to banging in response to questioning. So, for example, if something is, the answer is yes, bang twice. If it's no, bang once. And eventually I said to my father, look, this is all very well and good at each breakfast morning, you playing me these tapes, but really I'm not that interested. But if you can demonstrate that this thing can talk to me, then I'm going.
The BBC's nationwide programme produced a report on what was happening in Enfield. Reporter James Hogg adopted a slightly quizzical tone.
In the absence of a law against chairs that move on their own, the police were powerless to act. So the neighbours called in the man from the Society for Psychical Research. Maurice Grosse is an inventor who devotes his leisure to investigating the supernatural.
I have actually seen myself marbles being thrown about. I've seen the door moving without any help. I've also experienced the reduction of temperature.
For the last few days, we have been sleeping upstairs.
Meanwhile, Peggy Hodgson seemed reassured by the presence of a growing band of psychic researchers.
And I think it's made us feel a bit better.
But after a few days of relative tranquility, the poltergeist was back again, and this time it was captured on tape. Maurice Grosse provided the commentary.
Right way across the room and pulled it out of the socket.
It was clear that the youngest daughter, Janet Hodgson, was the centre of attention. John Burkham saw her levitating.
There she is, across this radio, one leg in the air and her head hanging down.
But why are you here? Is it because you want to give us a special message?
In early November of 1977, Maurice Grosse confronted the presence in the living room.
Are you having a game with me? Oh, right. As I asked the question, are you having a game with me? It threw the cardboard box and the pillow right in my face.
Well, we've just heard a noise, having come downstairs. We've just heard a noise upstairs.
Ros Morris joined Maurice Grosse for a nighttime vigil while the family were asleep.
Well, I'm hoping I'm not getting the microphone shaking in my hand, because that was rather an unnerving experience. Did you hear that? Seemed to be another thump. Seemed to be another thump.
It's been a violent morning.
Well, Rosalind, you're looking fairly fresh, I must say, after that night and being up till 5:30 this morning. Are you persuaded?
I think I more or less am, yes. I mean, I think what convinced me was the enormous thump when the chair, whatever happened, moved across the room. I mean, I'm convinced there wasn't time for that little girl to have got out of bed, stood up, chucked the chair across the room, because something chucked the chair across the room. I'm convinced of that.
Well, Ros Morris, you actually sounded a bit thrown yourself on that report. Was it quite disturbing?
Well, yes, it was, actually. That was the first time that I went there. That's when that happened. That was in September. I went back in the October and did some more stuff. And then in December, the Voices began, and I went back and recorded them. So an awful lot of stuff happened.
What did you think, Richard Grosse, listening back to hearing your father speaking there? Have you heard that recording many times?
He made so many tapes, hundreds of tapes over the period, and, I've heard some of them. They're all archived now in Cambridge University.
When you heard that, the knocks and the accounts of things flying through the air and everything, did you think somebody must be, pulling somebody's leg here, and
No.
somebody must be knocking in another room?
No, I didn't, because my father would not have presented me with something that he didn't believe in. My father was the most straightforward, down-to-earth person you could possibly come across.
Could you explain how the furniture moved? I suppose a sceptic might say, well, we know that magicians can be very clever on stage, that there was something attached to the bottom of the chair which somebody else somewhere in the house pulled.
Yes. And don't you think that if you were an investigator, the very first thing you would do would be to look for all those simple explanations? And of course, every time something happened, that's exactly what they did. And there were occasions, very few, when the children played, but they knew. My father had 3 children. He knew when children played. It was obvious. And of course, Mrs. Hodgson would have known, and she would never have allowed this whole situation to continue simply for a game.
It must be annoying for you, Graham, that you didn't manage to catch some of this stuff on camera, but you did manage to catch levitation on camera. And one of the neighbours said she saw Janet through the window from the street levitating. Now, sceptics might say this is just Janet sort of jumping up in the air.
I just pressed the button. And on this occasion, I was pressing the button in another room. I was there for something like 4 nights a week, up to 18 months. That family has got to get back to normal. They don't want grown men sitting in the corner of their bedrooms with cameras. So much was happening in the bedroom. We would then put a camera in with infrared flash, operated from another room. Morris would set up a tape recorder with a cable running upstairs for the mic in the bedroom. I'd listen to this live, and then as you heard the bang crash, you start to press the button. And that would take a sequence of so many frames per second. It was only the next day, when I'd get the film processed and have a look, that you realise that it was a sequence of what all the boffins, as I like to call them, put down as levitation.
Well, I've got one of these, and it's a colour photograph, one of these photographs in front of me. You kindly brought some along. And this is Janet, who described, she's not quite levitating, she's about to levitate, I think, and there's one of her flying through the air as well.
Well, it's a sequence of her. She started off lying flat, and in the other bed, the other side of the room, is her sister. Her sister's realised what's going on, so she started to scream. And I've started this sequence. She's come up from a prone position, flying across the room, and she's in mid-air, red nightdress. She's screaming, her sister's screaming. But at the end of the day, I'm sorry to keep on about this, I just take the photographs.
Common sense needs to be applied sometimes to situations which seem incredible. So we take, for example, that instance of levitation recorded by the baker and the lollipop lady, who both said that they saw Janet horizontally going up and down in the room. Now, how do you get yourself up from a horizontal position so that you are horizontal at the top, go back down again, and then get yourself up in the same way? Now, just apply common sense to that, and it can't be done.
But applying common sense, if I were a sceptic, I'd say, well, people, when they know there's something very odd going on in a house, sometimes see what they want to see.
These were people who were completely independent witnesses. I think that's the important point, as were so many of the people to these strange goings-on.
Your father, Richard, must have wanted some sort of further proof that there was a sentient person doing this somewhere in whatever form, and he decided that he'd actually try and communicate directly.
One morning, he triumphantly played the tape to me, which started off with the barking. And he said, well, if you can make that noise, then you can speak, you can say my name. So say my name, Morris. Nothing. Say my name, Morris. Morris. Say my full name, Morris Gross. Morris Gross. Like a barking dog, but with a sound. It was an old man's voice barking.
Let me hear you say my name again. Come on, let me hear you say my name. Come on, my name's Morris. Let me hear you say it. No. Now that was the first time we heard the voice, and since then we've been hearing it again and again, and it's been getting louder and louder.
The voice was only heard when the children were present in the room, appearing to emanate from behind Janet. BBC Scotland's Stuart Lamont spoke to the children and to the voice.
How many voices are there?
600.
600 the voices.
I know the joke.
How many really are there, Margaret?
I think so far we've had 10.
3.
When you hear the voice and it comes out, where does it come from? Here, your throat?
No.
Where do you feel it comes
Back
from?
of the neck. Back of the neck.
And so it must be as if it's somebody else speaking then, when you hear
Yeah,
it.
behind us.
My bed.
On later recordings, the voice seemed to become more conversational.
Why can't Janet feel you?
I'm invisible.
You're invisible? Why are you invisible?
So much H-O-S-T. Bow, 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 the pump. Chest is down the street. Merrily, 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 lovely part to trade. Now, smile.
Mr. Gross, a lot of people, hearing these voices produced by the children, will simply say that they are very good ventriloquists and that this is all a hoax.
They're certainly not very good ventriloquists. We have had tests on them to see whether they can ventriloquize. They can't. To keep up this particular type of voice for any length of time without damage to the vocal cords is absolutely impossible.
Don't you do it now? I come from doing halfway job.
The voice identified himself as a former resident of the house, Bill Wilkins, who died at the age of 72. He was cross-examined by Maurice Gross's son, Richard, a newly qualified solicitor.
I want you to tell me whether you remember what happened to you when you died.
I had an hemorrhage, and I fell asleep, and I died in a chair in a corner downstairs.
Richard, as you know, there are some people who say Janet, the daughter, one of the two daughters, might have been suffering from Tourette's syndrome. And one of the, you know what I'm going to say, one of the things that people who suffer from Tourette's get, and not all of them, is an ability to bark like a dog.
Yes, and that's, you know, I've heard that before, my father heard that. One has to remember that this voice, once it started to go, talked away. And it would talk incessantly for 2-3 hours. Now,
with that same gruff voice.
Exactly. So, if common sense, once again, you and try and speak in that fashion for 30 seconds. You'll have to clear your throat, you'll cough. After a few minutes, you'll have done damage to your voice. This is all supposed to be happening from a 12, 13-year-old girl.
Ros Morris?
People have said to me, well, did you think maybe there was a recording or something? But it didn't sound like a recording. You know, it was a different timbre to recorded speech. We all get phone calls now from someone who says, hello, have you been in an accident and that sort of stuff. And we can tell it's recorded.
And Richard Gross, we heard you interrogating, as a lawyer, in a sense, this strange being. Can you remember your first impressions when you got answers?
Absolutely. And listening to that tape again, which I haven't heard for many, many years, Bill, who was the voice, he described how he died. He said,
this is the former resident of the house.
This is the ghost. And
well,
I'll come on to that in a second.
Okay.
He said, I went blind, I had a hemorrhage, I fell asleep and died in a chair in the corner downstairs. One of the first things that my father did was he went over to Janet and said, Janet, what's hemorrhage? Janet looked at him blankly and she had no idea what that word meant. Subsequently, there was a radio programme of some description, perhaps London Broadcasting or something like that, and the description of the death of this entity was played. And my father got a phone call subsequently, and the chap said, I was very interested in hearing the tape and what happened, and I have to tell you, that was my father, who lived in the house, who did indeed go blind, and who did indeed die in that chair, in the room, in the house, from a hemorrhage.
And this was Bill Wilkins,
Yes.
the former resident.
Correct.
What was your impression about where the voice was actually coming from?
Well, that's the really weird thing. You couldn't work out where. It was just there. That's the thing. You couldn't work out where it was coming from. The girls would be just sitting there and this voice was there.
I mean, the first thing that came into my head was, right now, what are you seeing of yourself? You know, can you see your hands, your legs? What, you know, asking all these questions, but getting answers. And all the time that I'm getting these answers, the voice is in the room.
But where?
It's in the room. It's not coming from any particular person. It's in the room. All the ventriloquism and the Tourette syndrome and anything else you care to name, it doesn't persuade me one iota.
Graham?
Take the whole thing into context, where we've been there for months and months, and it was getting to the point where, well, I'm sorry, I was part of it. I was also to blame, but it was turning into a bit of a circus. And there were people coming through the house. We had Ray, what was his name, the ventriloquist? Ray
Allen.
Ray Allen came there one night to see if, with his agent.
Did he bring Lord Charles with him?
No, he may as well have done. I think just to see if the voices were, you know, if he could work out how the voices were coming. There were people coming from universities, there were people coming from showbiz, there were media people and all sorts. And, you know, whether the girls or the family, I mean, the boys weren't really around them, but the girls were just thinking, we almost want it to continue. There were things happening in rooms where there was no one in, all the rest of it, but it just, I don't know, maybe it was me it was just wearing a bit thin at the end.
It's interesting you should say that, Graham, because the whole media circus thing was very upsetting for my father and also for the family. You have to remember this was their home, and it was becoming dangerous. There was an iron grate of a fire.
Oh, when the fire was
pulled out and flew across the room. A pipe was thrown across the room, and frankly, if it had hit someone, it would spear them. But it got even more serious when Janet became almost possessed. It's difficult to know the right word. She went into trances. She had terrible dreams. She was very, very mentally upset. My father was deeply concerned for her welfare.
It was turning into a Victorian freak show, though, after a while. That was the problem. Everyone you explain it to now, you know their eyes glaze over, they all think you're mad, and the bottom line is, if you didn't see it yourself, if you didn't actually experience it yourself, you didn't believe it. And that's what was happening at the time. Everybody had to come along and see it for themselves. They came in as skeptics, and they left. If they were there when something happened, they left believing it. But you can't get the whole world come through the front room.
Can I ask you, did you believe in the supernatural when you first came to this house?
No.
A few weeks after the dramatic events in Enfield in 1977, lead witnesses continued to find themselves under scrutiny. Guy Playfair of the Society for Psychical Research.
I'm not saying there's supernatural. There's no such thing as supernatural. If anything happens, it's natural. We just don't understand it, nor does anybody else.
It's very difficult to produce these phenomena.
Dr. John Belloff, a psychologist from Edinburgh University, criticised the psychic researchers.
The phenomena themselves are somewhat alien to our modern scientific outlook, and not to be ignored is the fact that they tend to be to get contaminated with a lot of spurious claims that are really sort of rubbish, but they muddy the picture.
Skeptics pointed to this recording as evidence that the children had made it all up.
How does it feel to be haunted by a poltergeist?
It's not haunted. Shut up.
Why isn't it haunted?
I don't know.
But Maurice Gross came to Janet Hodgson's defence.
Why was the girl the centre of all this?
Well, the family was very highly stressed, and I believe that stress is the basis of poltergeist-type phenomena.
In later life, Maurice Gross looked back on his most famous case with mixed emotions, and he revealed that just a year before getting involved in the Enfield haunting, he'd lost a daughter, also called Janet.
Do you want it to be so, or not to be so?
Yes, I think I probably did, because I felt that this life was too constricting. I thought, well, there must be something else.
You found life boring?
I wouldn't say boring, not quite the word. I felt that there was more to life than just living on Earth.
Richard, I hope you don't think this is insensitive, but your father was in quite an emotional state at that point, and you would understand it absolutely as much as he did. He'd lost a daughter, also called Janet, a sister to you. Some of the sceptics would say, he was in a heightened emotional state.
This is a man who fought in the Second World War, who lived through the Blitz. When my sister died, it was a tragic event. And they were deeply upset, of course they were, and they never got over it. And it drove him to the society. It drove him to this event, and it drove him to the next 28 years of research. But it's absolutely inconceivable that he would allow the loss of my sister to colour anything that happened in the Enfield case.
And Ros, you were not there present, but we've just heard the recording of somebody talking to the two sisters, and one of them referring to a haunted house, and the other sister saying, shh, shh, it's not haunted, as if she'd been told to say that. And they used that as evidence that the girls were up to something.
Well, no, I don't think it's that. I think they knew that there was a lot of debate going on. I mean, I was amazed to find, once I got involved with this, that there is a whole history of poltergeist activity going back to the Romans reporting it, and then for hundreds of years this sort of thing has been reported. And there was a lot of debate going on as to whether a poltergeist is caused by a troubled young person, such as Janet at that time.
It's all in the mind, or not?
Graham talked about energy, whether they're creating some sort of energy that somehow, makes things happen, or is it to do with a haunting? And they would know that. Janet did say subsequently that she felt she'd been used in some way and that things were pushing her around and that sort of thing.
The strange things, as you put them, Ros, went on through 77 into 78, and then they suddenly stopped in 79. What do you make of that?
Well, there's a spiritualist view of it all. This is all ghosts, external forces, and there's an internal forces theory of the whole thing, which is sort of more Jungian and kind of says that the troubled young person is generating the energy, and it's often to do with puberty. Janet was exactly at that stage in her life.
And Richard?
And I think at this stage my father would have said, something, in my view, and it would be his personal view, it was probably a combination of the two. There you have a child in a troubled environment, at puberty, and opens up herself to energy. What is that energy? Well, it manifested itself as an old man who appeared to have lived and died in the house.
And Richard, just another thought. You did allude to it. Your sister, Janet, there was a strange occasion centred around her death, which involved a birthday card.
Yes, this is an extraordinary circumstance. My sister, who was 22 years old at the time and a cub reporter at the Caerphilly Leader in South Wales, was involved in a motorcycle accident in the centre of Cardiff. The driver was killed outright, and she was in hospital. She'd had extensive brain damage and she was on life support. So my mother and father travelled from Jersey to Cardiff Royal Infirmary. When I arrived, I saw my sister with two black eyes, her head swathed in bandages, in a hospital gown, looking a very forlorn individual. Later that day, we turned off the life support and she died. My parents stayed on, and I took the train back to London. And on the way back to London, I realised that that day was my birthday. And I knew that my sister would have sent me a birthday card. And I knew that that birthday card would be on the mat as I walked into the house. And this worried me because I was upset. I arrived home and I saw the card, I saw her handwriting, I went upstairs, I sat on the bed and I opened the card, and what I saw took my breath away. It was a cartoon card, and on the front page there was an image of, it's called an androgynous person, whose head was swathed in bandages with two black eyes in a hospital gown. And inside it said, "I was going to send you a bottle of toilet water for your birthday, but the lid fell on my head." She had written an arrow pointing to the word head, and she'd written underneath, "And there won't be much left of that soon anyway. Love, Jan." Welsh correspondent. That was the most clear instance of precognition that one can think of.
The most recent Hollywood version of the Enfield story was The Conjuring 2. A few details were changed. The psychic investigators were American, and it was laced with religious imagery.
My name is Bill Wilkins.
What do you make of that voice? The voice on this tape is coming from an 11-year-old girl.
Janet and Margaret Hodgson, the two girls at the centre of the case, have now moved from their childhood home in Enfield. Margaret lives in East London and Janet on the Essex coast. Both of them are married with children of their own. We invited both of them to take part in this programme, but neither felt able to do so. In a recent interview, though, they did reflect on what had happened to them all those years ago.
There was levitation, there was the voices, and then there was like incidents that happened to me that were like the curtain which wrapped itself around my neck, which was quite life-threatening for me. And it brought it home to me that this could kill you. I mean, I often think, why me? To sum it all up, to weigh it up all in one, I was used and abused.
He was all in a terrible state, very scared and tired of it. And it got worse as the time went on. We got more exhausted with it and tired. And then when we went to school, it actually got out into the neighbourhood that there was something strange going on in our house. And then it became known as the strange happenings in Enfield.
I know people say, and I don't care what they say, it wasn't them, it was me. I know what happened and I know it was real. How would they like it if this happened to them and they would be being called a fake or whatever? I don't care what they think. I know what happened and I know it was real.
We heard Janet at the beginning of that sequence saying she felt she was used and abused. Graham, do you think there's any possible sense in what she said?
Well, it started off where everyone was there to help. They had absolutely no idea what was going on. And you had to stop and say, look, these kids are going through it. And I don't know how she put up with it. I don't know how she lasted as long as she did.
Well, in a sense, at first she didn't really know how to put up with it, did she? Because she ended up in the Maudsley Hospital, which is for people with mental health problems. It used to be called a psychiatric hospital.
Not for mental health issues. She went there for consideration as to what was the state of her mental health. I think this was the time they were having shared dreams and where she was showing a lot of stress, but there was no implication of her being mentally unstable in any way. She was actually given a very clean bill of health by the hospital.
And you, Ros, went and visited her. What sort of state was she in at that point?
Oh, she was fine when we went to see her in the Maudsley. She seemed perfectly normal, and she said that she didn't think much was happening around her. I mean, one of the things that Margaret in a subsequent interview said that she jumps at things even now, and one of the things that happens, it all gets sort of hyper-vigilant in the house, and people look at the slightest thing and start to think it's something supernatural. And Janet in the Maudsley sort of said, well, it was good to be, in a quieter place, and she did sometimes wonder if things were happening, but they didn't seem to be.
Yes, there was a huge amount of stress in the house. I mean, Janet, seeing her sister cry just about every time you spoke to her, and Mum, you couldn't talk to Mum. She's trying to run a household with 3 or 4 children there, no husband, no money. So Janet was by far the brightest of them all. She was doing French, she was doing German. I would come around in the evenings, and it got to the point where I wasn't really there as a photographer. I was there to, like a social worker sort of thing. I was trying to help her with her homework, and you just felt so bad for the family.
And looking back now, all these years, gosh, just over 40 years ago now, what effect did the Enfield poltergeist have on you, Graham? Did it change the way you thought about the inexplicable?
Yes, I haven't got any closer to working out what it is. I still think it's something scientific and not spooky.
Ros Morris, you were smiling in agreement, I think, with Graham.
Well, yes, I mean, it's a very odd thing to have been involved with. I mean, as I say, I never intended to be, but then it turned out that it would be very
because
interesting.
it was a slow news day.
Exactly, it was a slow news day. But then, as I say, I did go back and do the radio documentary because I felt it was an important topic that people should be able to assess for themselves. And it's one of those things where you do have to think about it, but I don't know what it is that caused all this. I just know there was something very, very strange going on. And I think the other interesting thing about it is that for all of us, it kind of died away. I mean, the Poltergeist films came out and so on and so on. But then the internet came along. And suddenly, on the internet, there's stuff about the Enfield Poltergeist with 1 million hits, 1.5 million hits. All this, there's huge interest in this.
Richard Gross?
In my conversations with friends and people that you meet, if they get to hear about the circumstance, there are those that turn their back immediately and will not engage. And why not? That's probably what I would have done had this not happened to me. However, those who do engage, my goodness, they're interested. They've got things to say, things have happened to them. In today's environment, 40 years on, we have on our screens programs that purport to tell us about the universe in all kinds of ways. You know, you look out and you are told there are infinite numbers of galaxies. How on earth can we think that our knowledge of what goes on is in a box, like scientists think?
Richard Gross, Graham Morris and Ros Morris, thank you very much indeed.
Pleasure. Thank you.